Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. India's G20 meeting ends without consensus on Russia-Ukraine war. Putin accuses what he calls Ukrainian saboteurs of firing at civilians in terrorist attack in Russia's Bryansk region. Plus, the Pentagon dismisses reports that the U.S. is providing intelligence for attacks in Russia. Thank you so much for joining us again. A meeting of the group of G20 has ended without a consensus on the Ukraine war, as China joined Russia in refusing to support a demand for Moscow to cease hostilities. Now, the two were the only countries at the gathering of the G20 foreign ministers on Thursday in New Delhi not to agree on a statement demanding Russia's complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. India's foreign minister says there were divergencies that could not be reconciled, as various parties held different views. He added that members of the G20, a group of the world's largest economies, agreed on most issues involving the concerns of less developed nations, like strengthening multilateralism, promoting food and energy security, climate change, gender issues, and counter-terrorism. Russian President Vladimir Putin says a Ukrainian sabotage group had knowingly fired at civilians in what he calls a terrorist act on Russian territory close to the border. Russian news agencies reported earlier that a group of Ukrainian saboteurs had taken hostages in the Bryansk region, while the regional governor said one person had been killed. However, Ukrainian officials denied responsibility.
Russian soldiers are protecting people from neo-Nazis and terrorists, from those who tortured and killed people in the Donbass for 8 years, those who killed Deretogin in Moscow, those who today committed another terrorist act, another crime. They infiltrated the border territory and opened fire on civilians. They saw it was a civilian car. They saw there were civilians and children sitting there, an ordinary model of car, and opened fire on them.
Russian President Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov says that Moscow had been forced to suspend its participation in the New START nuclear arms control treaty because Washington was using it to help Ukraine attack Russian strategic sites. Speaking at the United Nations Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, he says that the United States and its Western allies wanted to see Russia strategically defeated in Ukraine and accused them of fanning the conflict there.
The situation has further degraded following the U.S. attempts to probe the security of the Russian strategic facilities declared under the New START treaty by assisting the Kiev regime in conducting armed attacks against them. Against this background, we perceived as highly cynical those demands by Washington to regain access to Russia's nuclear facilities for inspecting them under the treaty. This is especially so in the current circumstances, when the U.S., together with other Western countries, including nuclear states such as France and the United Kingdom, have set their course with a goal to strategically defeat Russia in a total hybrid war unleashed against U.S., which is contrary to the fundamental principles and general political understandings enshrined in the preamble of the New START treaty. Under these circumstances, we were forced to announce the suspension of the treaty.
Meanwhile, Ryabkov also says Moscow would not carry out tests if Washington also refrained, but that Russia still had to prepare for the worst. He also accuses the United States of providing intelligence on the location of strategic sites inside Russia to Ukraine.
We are not going to be the first to test a nuclear device. Russia has ratified CTBT in the year 2000, which was preceded by a lengthy moratorium for nuclear testing. If the US does not test, we will not. But we should be prepared for the worst. To rephrase something which is repeated quite frequently by our American counterparts recently, US and Kyiv are able to stop this tomorrow if they take the right decisions. Some time ago, Kyiv undertook UAV attacks on facilities that provide basis for our long-range aviation in Saratov region and also in Ryazan region. We know that those attacks would never be possible in absence of a very deep and sophisticated assistance by the US to the Ukrainian military, including targeting, of course, intelligence provision, and also some technical assistance of other sorts.
Now, in reaction to that allegation, the Pentagon in the US says the United States is not providing Ukraine with intelligence for targets inside Russia, calling the Russian accusations as nonsense. The Pentagon spokesperson, Brigadier General Pat Ryder, added that the US is not at war with Russia, and neither do they seek war with Russia.
I have seen some press reporting from Russian officials, first of all, alleging that the U.S. was somehow providing information to enable these types of attacks. What I would tell you, first of all, is, again, I don't have any information in regards to whether or not the Ukrainians have conducted these type of operations. I'd refer you to them. I can say definitively that the notion of the U.S. providing intelligence or information to the Ukrainians to target locations inside Russia is nonsense. We are not at war with Russia, nor do we seek war with Russia. Our focus is purely on supporting Ukraine to defend itself, and so that's what we'll continue to do. As you've heard us say before, we are regularly consulting with the Ukrainians on the appropriate use of the equipment that we provide to them, and all indications are that they continue to stay very focused on defending their homeland and fighting within Ukraine. So I'll just leave it at that.
Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price says the U.S. is not expecting formal senior dialogue with Russia in the near term. It comes after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke face-to-face on the sidelines of the G20 meeting that we reported earlier. Antony Blinken told Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to end the war and urge Moscow to reverse its suspension of the New START nuclear treaty.
More formal senior level dialogue in the near term. Of course, we're always going to remain open to dialogue. We believe in dialogue. We believe in diplomacy, especially even when times are tense, especially when the state of our relationship is as it is now, and as the Russians are perpetrating what they're doing against Ukraine. There are issues that are of profound importance to the United States, but also issues that are of profound importance to the rest of the world. But there was no agreement or consensus coming out of that brief encounter for any sort of follow-up discussion, but we're always going to take advantage of opportunities to convey our interests in manners that are clear and direct whenever we can. First, what this was not, as opposed to what it was. You heard from the Secretary this was a rather brief encounter with Foreign Minister Lavrov. This was not a bilateral meeting. This was not a protracted discussion between the two. This was a rather brief encounter that the Secretary took advantage of to convey clearly and directly messages that are important to the United States and, in many cases, to the rest of the world. The Secretary outlined those three messages. His first was on New START. And again, we've spoken extensively to this since the Russian Federation suspended its implementation of the New START treaty, because it's not only a concern for the United States as a responsible nuclear power, but it should be, and in fact is, a concern for the rest of the world, as the rest of the world expects Russia and the United States, just as we did with the Soviet Union during the course of the Cold War, to cooperate and to engage in talks on strategic stability and arms control. Second, you mentioned this, but the Secretary did raise, as he consistently has, the continued wrongful detention of U.S. citizen Paul Whelan. He noted that we had put a proposal on the table. He, again, encouraged Russia to accept it. And third, he underscored our continued commitment to Ukraine, including the proposals that we've heard from President Zelensky and his government for a just and durable peace, a peace that respects the UN Charter, as well as the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
And the White House has announced that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen will meet U.S. President Joe Biden in Washington on March the 10th to discuss energy, supply chains, China, and a task force set up to cut EU dependence on Russian fossil fuel. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby says that both leaders will also discuss support for Ukraine, security challenges, and coordination to combat the climate crisis.
President Biden looks forward to welcoming next week President Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission here to the White House on Friday, the 10th of March, another working visit. We expect their discussion to cover a range of international security challenges, of course, including support for Ukraine. They will also discuss U.S. and EU coordination to combat the climate crisis and clean tech, and take stock of the Joint Task Force on Europe's energy security that they both established a year ago.
In the meantime, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva told Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky he will encourage countries to join peace talks to end the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. During his nightly address to the nation, Zelensky says he and Lula discussed international efforts to implement the peace formula. Zelensky also says he expressed gratitude to Lula for Brazil's vote in the favor of the UN resolution last week that called for peace and demanded Moscow withdraw its troops.
I've just had a conversation with the President of Brazil, a very useful talk. We are resuming contacts between our countries at the highest level. I've informed him about Russia's attacks against our people, about the murders of our children, about the strikes on our civilian infrastructure. I express gratitude to Brazil for supporting our resolution on peace and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We discussed diplomatic efforts that could stop Russian aggression and restore peace in our country, the region, and the whole world.
Now, outside the Russian detention center in Kherson, days after the southern Ukrainian city was liberated, a 20-year-old Ihor shivered as he recalled what he endured inside. Ihor, that's his name, said, quote, "I was kept there for 11 days, and throughout that time I heard screaming from the basement. I was stabbed in the legs with a taser. They used it as a welcome. One of them asked what I'd been brought in for, and another two of them started hitting me in the ribs." He adds that people were tortured, they were beaten with sticks in the arms and legs, cattle prods, even hooked up to batteries and electrocuted or waterboarded with water. Kherson was the first large city and only regional capital Russian troops were able to occupy since the start of the invasion. The detention center Ihor was held in was part of a network of at least 20 facilities that Ukrainian and international lawyers says were part of a calculated Russian strategy to extinguish Ukrainian identity. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed that he met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the G20 in New Delhi. As we reported earlier, And Mr. Blinken says, quote, I urge Russia to reverse its irresponsible decision and return to implementing the New START Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which places verifiable limits on the nuclear arsenals of the U.S. and the Russian Federation. Mutual compliance is in the interest of both our countries. It also what people around the world expect from us as nuclear powers. He says he told Lavrov that the U.S. will be ready to engage with Russia on matters of strategic nuclear arms control. Blinken also says he urges Russia to end its war in Ukraine and enter negotiations, reiterating the U.S. support for Ukraine. And the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby says the U.S. will announce a new military aid package for Ukraine. Mr. Kirby says ongoing military aid to Ukraine will be a topic of discussion between the President Joe Biden and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz when the two leaders meet at the White House later today.
We'll see us tomorrow. Just unilaterally, the U.S. will have another round of assistance for Ukraine coming tomorrow, and it will include mostly ammunitions and munitions that the Ukrainians will need for the systems that they already have, like the HIMARS and the artillery. So I can't predict a specific outcome tomorrow. I wouldn't look for that, but certainly they will be discussing additional support for Ukraine going forward.
Now, Sweden's Defense Minister Paul Johnson says Sweden joining NATO along with Finland was a major unexpected consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He says this will fundamentally change the geostrategic situation in northern Europe, highlighting the importance of this move for the collective defense of the alliance. Johnson told the Baltic Defense College Conference on Security in Europe that Sweden had a tradition of extensive military cooperation with NATO and that its national defense capabilities, its assets and capabilities will make the alliance stronger.
NATO is about to be enlarged with 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, whereby the geostrategic situation in the Northern Europe will change fundamentally and make us all stronger. Meanwhile, the war rumbles on with no end in sight, and despite the heavy losses of personnel and equipment, there's no signs that Russia has changed its strategic objectives to dominate Ukraine in clear contravention of international law. In Northern Europe, the geostrategic landscape is undergoing important change as Sweden and Finland are making their way into NATO. If Moscow had one strategic goal with my country and with Finland, I think it was to keep us outside of NATO. 3 months after this war started, Sweden and Finland, hand in hand, applied for NATO membership. That is the mother of all unintended consequences for Russian geostrategic thinking, believe me. With almost 30 years of close partnership with NATO, Sweden has a tradition of extensive military cooperation with the alliance, Swedish national defense capabilities. We have assets and capabilities who we think will make NATO's collective defense stronger. And we can also provide the alliance with strategic depth and connect eastern NATO countries with the Atlantic. In terms of geography, we add the longest shoreline in the Baltic Sea, the island of Gotland, its strategic location and important ports in the North Sea. With Sweden's naval assets, resources, and a strong position in the air comes a solid understanding of the entire Baltic Sea, and we think we can make that, providing that will also make NATO stronger.
After the break, China is beating the West in the race for 37 out of 44 critical technologies, according to a report. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You may have heard the term, money makes the world go round. Well, the same can apply to business. And we have our business correspondent, Laddie Williams, who will be breaking down some of the finer points of this conflict in Ukraine that has gone way beyond a year now.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's been a long time, and we've seen so much, you know, happen at this time. And at the end of the day, we see the Russian economy still kind of resilient with all that.
Still resilient after a year.
Exactly.
Now, the Eurozone inflation projected to soften in February.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, because we know the Eurozone, they've been through a lot in 2022 with from sky high inflation, and most economists are predicting that the Eurozone will fall into recession by 2022, and the risk is still there, you know, even though we're in 2023, and somehow the Eurozone got a kind of softish landing, you know, for the economy in 2022. But looking at the data from the European Union Statistical Office, we see that they're projecting that inflation will drop from 8.6% in January to 8.5% in February. So it might seem like a little drop, but you know, in economics, it's quite a big drop, and it shows a sign that, you know, inflation is kind of like going down, which is good, because we've seen how, you know, the central bank, the ECB has raised rates, you know, to levels not seen, and we've seen them try to battle inflation. Same thing, you know, globally, and you know, some would say, oh, maybe the work of the central bank is we're starting to feel the impact with the inflation rate going down. But this is mostly due to energy prices going down, because at the end of the day, it's energy prices that really drove the inflation rate in Eurozone and most parts of the world. We saw natural gas prices that hit a record high of about $10 in 2022. But they're back down now to below the $3 mark. That's talking about natural gas. And we're seeing all of that, you know, help reduce, bring down inflation in the Eurozone, even though we're seeing, you know, other non-oil products actually going up. We've seen food prices, you know, still high, but not as high as in 2022. But it just goes to show how much energy prices have impacted, you know, inflation in the Eurozone. So this projection.
Yeah, who does this benefit more, Russia or Ukraine, or both?
So at the end of the day, you know, it benefits all of us, because it benefits because it's a global village, you know, at this point. And looking at where we are now, everyone is battling inflation. We've seen all the sanctions, you know, leveled on Russia, trying to, you know, bring down that, you know, Putin's war chest. They've seen the price caps on oil and all of that. But at the end of the day, you know, we've seen analysts say, you know, these sanctions are also hurting, you know, other economies at the same time, even though we're trying to bring, you know, Russia to its knees. So at the end of the day, it's you can't really say who the winners are with all of this. It almost seems like we're all losers, because we're seeing the global economy impacted by this war. Even though the sanctions are growing, every economy is still feeling the bite of this war.
Yeah, certainly they want the squeeze to be put on Russia's economy as a deterrent to continue prosecuting the war.
Exactly.
But now that the Russia's GDP is slowing down to 3.2%, what does that connote?
It's a slower deceleration at this point, because in December, we saw the GDP fall at a rate about 4.2%, but now it's kind of reduced about 3.2%. So it's just showing the resilience of the Russian economy, even though, you know, they've been hammered with sanctions on all sides, from the price cap on Russian oil, and, you know, limiting them to fewer buyers, because we know how much, you know, Russia makes from, you know, selling oil and gas to Europe. So they've lost a lot of customers with this war. They've lost customers in Europe, you know, buying a natural gas from them. So this is all, you know, impacting revenue coming into Russia. And at the end of the day, we're seeing some oligarchs now getting quite vocal at this time, talking about how, you know, the money in Russia is actually dwindling, and they expect it to fall even more as years go by, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to sell your products. With these sanctions, you're not able to trade freely as you would. You're losing customers. So at the end of the day, your revenue is being squeezed, and we're seeing that, even though the ruble is still quite strong, according to some quarters, but some analysts still say the cracks are there, in the Russian economy, and it's in the long term we would really see things unravel in that economy. But for now, the data is still showing that the economy is still resilient even with the sanctions, but you can't say they're not feeling the pinch. At this point, talking about the Russian economy, looking at the GDP data.
Here's a very interesting question. The U.S. Congress targeting South Africa over deepening ties with Russia.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that they're not the only ones who have not cut off ties with Russia.
Yeah.
There are other countries that are dealing with Russia.
Exactly.
Why single South Africa out? And
because at the end of the day, we've seen, India and China are still one of the top customers of Russia at this point, even though we've seen the U.S. and its allies try to, get them on their side, get, other countries that are still dealing with Russia on the side. But it's proving quite difficult, at this point. And we know South Africa and Russia, they belong to a bloc called BRICS. So it's understandable that, South Africa will still, do business with them and still, kind of like deepen ties, even though they've kept mum about the war. And even though they've also, talked about peace, trying to, project peace and all of that. But at the end of the day, secondary sanctions are still a big risk, at this point. And now, seeing how, South Africa is allowing, Russian naval soldiers actually dock on their waters. So they're kind of like giving Russia some kind of advantage here, and the West, they don't want to see that, and it's risky, for South Africa at this point, because they are at risk of getting secondary sanctions, which will be bad for their economy. And at the end of the day, you still want to, even though you want to deal with the so-called enemy, you still want to try and protect your economy. So South Africa, they have a big choice.
Not to come in at a good time. We know that South Africa has an energy problem at the moment, and problems with their economy.
Eskom and all of that. And
as well.
Yeah. So,
but what form of sanctions, or do you think that the U.S. Congress could encourage against South Africa?
They could come in different forms.
Trade.
They could come, and obviously trade is always the fastest target. And obviously, if your trade is impacted, that impacts your revenue from exports. So looking at where they are now, I know that economy, they don't need that kind of sanction right now. And
exactly,
it could also come in the same sanctions we're seeing with Russia with the international payments. They could also level that on South Africa. So it's something they really need to think about. They really need to decide what position they want to be, with this war. And
yes, because it's a delicate act, balancing act.
Very
because
delicate.
South Africa does have good ties with the United States.
Exactly.
There's hardly a United States president does not want to visit South Africa post-apartheid to show their human rights concerns around the world, big brother of the West to the rest of the world, especially Africa. And South Africa has always been a go-to place for the U.S. So it's interesting that the U.S. Congress is towing this line.
Yeah, they are. It's quite interesting, and also quite expected, because we're seeing them also try to do the same thing, try and bring India and China, on their side to try and alienate Russia as much as they can. But it's definitely not easy, to get, because at the end of the day, every country, they have advantages and what they're gaining from having ties with other countries. So it's a tough one. It's not easy, but we'll keep watching to see how South Africa actually plays this, because at the end of the day, the risk of secondary sanctions is very present right now.
All right. So the U.S. Congress should not rob Peter to pay Paul. They should also go after India, or if that's
China.
If that's what they do, China. If that's what
Even
they're
though
doing.
we're seeing tensions growing, with U.S.-China relations, with balloons popping up,
of course,
everywhere.
That's an entirely different story.
A whole new story.
Thank you, Laddie.
No problem.
Our business correspondent, Laddie Williams, who you can join for more business news after this program at the top of the next hour. Meanwhile, residents from the area surrounding Bakhmut have arrived in the Russian-controlled city of Shakhtarsk in the Ukraine Donetsk region. A woman called Yelena Yvaslevskaya and her husband live near Bakhmut. Now, it's an eastern Ukrainian city that became an area of long and intense battle between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The couple and their children spent weeks living with shells landing and flying over their heads before being able to evacuate. She says she was helped by Russian forces, including Wagner Group fighters. Wagner has spearheaded Russia's assaults on the city, which had a pre-conflict population of about 75,000 people, and has made steady but incremental progress around the city's outskirts in recent months, endangering Ukraine's supply lines. Ukrainian forces were reported to be hanging on to their positions in Bakhmut early on Thursday, but Russian troops have sustained their attacks as they seek to claim their first major victory for more than half a year. The U.S. has put forward a serious proposal to Moscow for Paul Whelan's release. This is according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who cited a case of wrongful detention. He added that America would not rest until it has secured Paul Whelan's release and that of every other American citizen who is unjustly detained around the world. Elizabeth Whelan, Paul's sister, spoke following Blinken's exchange with Lavrov, saying, and you remember Lavrov and Blinken met on the sidelines of the G20 meeting, saying, quote, "Of course, we are pleased to see Paul's case elevated in this manner and take a great deal of comfort in the fact that the Secretary of State continues to press for a solution to Paul's wrongful detention. Now that Brittany Griner has been home for almost 3 months, it's time for the Russian authorities to continue discussions to resolve the situation. Paul is waiting to come home to Michigan, where he belongs, away from the deplorable conditions in the Russian labor camp where he's been held for so long." Now, coming up, Oscar hopeful nominated film shines light on Ukraine crisis. Welcome back, and let's speak with Ambassador to Switzerland, Ambassador Joseph Ayolugu, who joins us virtually from London. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir. Let's begin with the attack on a Russian village, Yubachny to be exact, where we heard the Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that again that there's been an infiltration by what he called Ukrainian nationalists. And there's disparaging figures as to how many casualties there were. We read 1, but there are reports that there were 2 people that died, 2 adults and a 10-year-old child. Now, is there a danger? Because there's a group that posted an online video called the Russian Volunteer Corps, who said that they infiltrated the Luhansk area and that they were responsible. They're anti-Kremlin, they're anti-Putin, and they're supposedly, allegedly, still under investigation, operating out of Ukraine. Is there a danger that will affect the Russians, not the Ukrainians, that there's an Achilles heel developing of nationalists who are anti-Kremlin and anti-Putin and who will conduct this sort of guerrilla-type attacks against Russia, which Ukraine has denied,
of course,
by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. There's that possibility. Putin's war has generated a variety of issues, and you can't exclude anything. For instance, even in some of the countries near, like Belarus, for instance, there is a strong anti-Russian feeling there that have also led to people who militias and so on carrying on that are bent on putting an end or seeing an end to Russian invasion of antagonism towards Ukraine. So these are quite likely scenarios, possibilities, and we should expect, Russia should expect to see more of this.
Pentagon spokesperson, Brigadier General Pat Ryder, says that they're not seeking war with Russia, that is the U.S. They're not provoking war with Russia. There's something that used to be known as the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. This is in response to accusations that the United States is furnishing Ukraine with intelligence so as to aid them in their attacks against Russia.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
What is your impression of the United States saying that they are not furnishing Ukraine with any information that will help in the fight against Russia as far as locations is concerned, the locations of strategic places in Russia is concerned, using their satellites and their intelligence network and their military power?
Well, we probably would accept that on face value, but the scenario is, and which U.S. has not denied, that they are backing Ukraine, and backing Ukraine could mean a variety of things. If Ukraine needs information on specific strategic locations or facilities, we can't rule out that they would get it somehow, if it helps, if it's considered that it will help in their protecting themselves. U.S. is definitely committed to protecting Ukraine against Putin's invasion. That's clear. So under that umbrella, we can see all sorts of helps.
Ambassador, you recall that there's a man called, a former U.S. Marine called Paul Whelan, who is in Russian custody, has been there for over 4 years. And we know that on the sidelines of this G20 meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was speaking to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov about releasing Mr. Paul Whelan, now saying that he was unjustly incarcerated and being held in Russia. It appears the U.S. and Russia are still talking. How does this impact their relationship with Ukraine, if it does at all?
Well, they are talking. They are talking. It's not unusual. The issue of the American in the Russian custody is there. They would probably keep him there as a pawn that could be used when it's necessary. But obviously, with regard to the issue of Russia's invasion against Ukraine, U.S. is clear about it. It goes against, the global rules about respect for sovereignty, and that they are committed to support Ukraine, which is what they are doing. And I don't think that it changes with any type, even in spite of any type of discussion that they might be holding. And it's quite, it's in order. It's in order from the point of global diplomacy. There are side issues you will talk about, but the core issue now is this war, and the U.S. is committed to it, to preventing Russia from carrying out all the negative attacks against Ukraine. So I don't think that's anything unusual.
Yes, Ambassador. A number of countries around the world in different fora, such as the G20 and such as the United Nations General Assembly have made proclamations that Russia should withdraw from Ukraine. There was a number of African countries at the UN General Assembly that did this. At the G20, Russia, of course, and China refrained. Concerning the African countries, how much leverage does this have against Russia?
Well, it's the same. Well, the point is that a majority of sovereign countries all over, including in Africa, have sent a message to Russia that the war against, the aggression against Ukraine is unnecessary and is unacceptable and runs against the global rules about respect for territoriality and sovereignty, and that they should withdraw. So, of course, Russia isn't taking that, because this is not the first time again that they've been told, either at the UN or separately. So I would say that we would keep passing, the majority would keep passing on that message. It's left to Putin to react in respect of relations with countries and the global rules and norms.
Thank you so much for your time on speaking with us, Ambassador Joseph, former Ambassador of Switzerland, Ambassador Joseph Ayolugu, out of London. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Larry.
Now, a report by an Australian think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, has found that China leads the world in 37 out of 44 critical technologies. According to a report, China is in a position to become the world's top technology superpower. Let that sink in for a moment. With its dominance already spanning defense, space, robotics, energy, the environment, biotechnology, AI, artificial intelligence, advanced material, and key quantum technology. The key areas dominated by China include drones, machine learning, electric batteries, nuclear energy, photovoltaics, quantum sensors, and critical mineral extraction. Now, China's dominance in some fields is so entrenched that all of the world's top 10 leading research institutions for certain technologies are located in the country, according to ASPI. In comparison, the United States leads in just 7 critical technologies, including space launch systems and quantum computing, which receives funding from the Australian, the UK, and US governments, as well as private sector sources, including the defense and tech industries. Finally, the filmmaker of a documentary about a Ukrainian children's shelter says he hopes its Oscar nomination will shine a massive light on the situation in conflict hit Ukraine, and crucially, on how it affects the children there. The film, which was shot before the beginning of the 2022 conflict, shows daily life at an establishment in eastern Ukraine for children who've been temporarily removed from their parents, following the minors who live there and the social workers who work for them and look after them. The latest film is the Danish director's second about eastern Ukraine, after 2017's multi-award-winning The Distant Barking of Dogs, title of that film. The winner will be announced on March 12th at the awards ceremony in Los Angeles, United States.
One of the reasons why it's been so wonderful to get nominated for an Oscar is that it's shone a massive light on Ukraine and more exactly on the kids that are caught in this conflict, because my film deals with a very narrow area of land out in the east before this recent flare-up of the war, and the concern I could carry was that now with Russia having attacked all of Ukraine, this small problem will spiral out and encompass the whole country, which means that it's a problem that will leave marks for generations to come if nothing is done. So I hope that my film and the Oscar platform it gives us, the attention it gives us, that can help keep people's attention to this problem and hopefully also gather as much support also on the long term in helping Ukraine deal with this.
And that's where we leave it for this edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you so much for watching. Do have a great weekend and see you again.